My name is Corrine Alfeld. I'm a program officer in the National Center for Education Research at IES. The name of this session is The Big Picture, Education Access and Opportunities in 4 States. Unlike research on teaching and learning, IES-funded education systems and policy research examines the big picture using large data sets and mixed methods to understand how state and district education decisions affect learning. Such a lens allows us to examine how large groups of students are affected. This session will highlight current projects in the Improving Education Systems grant portfolio that focus on student access to educational opportunities in 4 different states. The first 2 projects examine the impact of desegregation efforts, one via busing and another via school choice, to decrease unequal access to learning. The next 2 projects examine the provision of additional education services for gifted and high-achieving students from across districts within a state, with special attention to underserved student groups and peer comparison. We will hear the 4 presentations, followed by remarks from our discussant. Then we'll have time for questions with the researchers after the discussion in a live interactive Q&A session. Thank you, and let's get started with Elizabeth Setrin from Tufts University.
Hello, thanks everyone for coming. My name is Elizabeth Setrin. I'm a professor at Tufts University, and today I'm excited to share my work on the METCO voluntary desegregation busing program. This work is still preliminary, so I'd appreciate it if you do not cite without permission. So why study school integration? Well, we're over 60 years past Brown v. Board, and which ruled that school segregation was illegal in the US. And yet we still have persistent lack of equal access to educational opportunities, both by race and socioeconomic status. And this problem is in fact growing since the 1980s, where the proportion of students of color, particularly poor students of color in like concentrated segregated schools has more than doubled since 2001. And so in this line of research funded by IES, we're interested in what the impact of racial desegregation and also inclusion is on a range of educational, social, economic, and political outcomes. So the setting for this study is METCO, which is a voluntary desegregation busing program in Massachusetts. And similar programs exist in about 12 cities across the US. METCO is one of the longest running programs, and it really serves as a national model because of its prominence. And what it does is students of color from the city of Boston and also Springfield, Massachusetts, apply to the program. And if they're admitted, then they are bused to about 36 suburban districts, which are majority white and predominantly wealthier districts. And they opted in many years ago to accept students of color from the city of Boston. And the goal of this program, which is funded by the state, is to improve both urban and suburban students' educational experiences by giving them exposure to students from diverse backgrounds and cultures. And here's a map of Massachusetts where you can see the sending cities of Boston and Springfield in the dark blue. Here's Boston. And then the light blue are the many suburban districts that participate, and red are the few districts that no longer participate but once did. So you can see these students are traveling sometimes rather far, upwards of over an hour each way to their suburban school. So this project is situated in the literature a few different ways. So first, it's going to comment on the effect of desegregation and also increased diversity in a school setting, contributing to the literature on court-ordered desegregation and voluntary desegregation. And it also has broader implications as we think about how to promote diversity and integration in public schools. So states and cities that are thinking about enrollment policies and school choice may find this helpful. And lastly, we can learn something here about school impacts versus neighborhood impacts. So For the urban students, we're really isolating the impact of enrolling in a very high performing, wealthier suburban school district while holding the home neighborhood fixed. So it's like a reverse moving to opportunity experiment, which roughly held school quality pretty consistent and constant, but changed the neighborhood characteristics students were exposed to. So this project has multiple parts. One is a historical analysis looking at students who applied to the program back to the 60s, to the modern era, and also their peers in the suburban schools, and looking at the long run effects of the program on these earlier eras. And then today we'll be focusing on the modern data, which is once school enrollment data actually became available, the modern administrative data that we'll see in some of the other projects today as well. And then the project looks at both the impact on urban students and the impact on their suburban peers. So today I'll be focusing on this part, the urban impact. Okay, so the strategy for this is to compare students who applied to MECO but didn't get an offer to participate to applicants that also applied but were able to be admitted. So I'll be using an instrumental variables approach to compare those with and without offers. And the reason for this is that these students are already much more similar to each other because they've opted in to apply to the program. And there might be unobservable differences these students have to students who didn't opt in to apply. We'll also add a lot of control variables to adjust for any differences that there might be between those that get offers and those that don't. Given the short time today, I don't have as much time as I'd like to go into the actual application process and how we argue we have a good comparison group, but there's more in the paper to come. And we also are able to control for a wide set of control variables, including parents' level of education, whether their parents were married when they were born, and whether they're on Medicaid. So even if our treatment and control group are different, we're able to control for a lot of important socioeconomic factors. And we find that after we control for these things, we have pretty good balance on a range of student characteristics and family characteristics. So jumping into the results, first looking at standardized test scores, we see that on average, 1 year of participation in the MECO program leads to a 0.02 standard deviation boost in math test scores. And that's pretty consistent across all of the grades. So this is averaging like the effect of an average year in the program. So for these third graders, this is saying, if a student is in MECO grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, an average effect of that across 3 years is that it boosted their third grade test scores by 0.02 standard deviations. So the effects do accumulate over time. And then here we see in English, the results are fairly similar. We also see some positive effects, although they're very small, on attendance. So I view this more so as we might expect attendance to be lower in a busing program, especially one where students have to go rather far away from their home. So if they miss the bus or if they have a doctor's appointment in the morning, it might be they might have fewer options to get to school because they have, it's farther away. So we might think that we might see lower attendance for participating in the program, but we don't see this. Instead, we see pretty close to zero effect. If anything, it's a little bit positive. We also see a reduction in suspension. So students who get into the MECO program versus those that don't are slightly less likely to be suspended and also experience fewer days of suspension on average while in the program. Moving on to longer run outcomes, there's kind of a mixed bag on both high school outcomes and college preparation. So on the one hand, participating in MECO does significantly increase the likelihood students take the SAT. And they do score better on it, but on a margin of its boosting scores around 1,000, it's not really boosting scores much above 1,400 or 1,300, but it is increasing this threshold of, lower scores of about like 500 in math, 500 in English. It's much more likely for them to reach that bar. But there's no effect on the number of AP courses they take, the number of AP exams, or the scores they get on them. So they're in schools that have many more AP class options, but they're not any more likely to take these courses than they were in the other options they had. Participating in MECO does boost the likelihood of high school graduation, both 4-year and 5-year, by a significant amount, and it reduces dropout. It also shifts students' college aspirations. So in Massachusetts, students are asked in 10th grade what they want to do after high school, and these participants in MECO are 6.5 percentage points more likely to aspire to go to college, and specifically it's shifting their aspirations from a 2-year college to a 4-year college, which in Massachusetts, we have a much higher success rate in the 4-year colleges than in 2 years. So students are much more likely to get a 4-year degree if they initially start at a 4-year college. Moving on to college outcomes, students who participate in MECO, again, it doesn't just change their aspirations, it actually makes them more likely to initially enroll in a 4-year, shifting them from a 2-year to a 4-year. And it increases their initial college enrollment by 12 percentage points. And this is in all different types of schools, both in-state and out-of-state publics, and also private 4-year colleges. And the students aren't more likely to go to the most competitive colleges, according to Barron, schools that have acceptance rates of under 15%, but they are more likely, under a third, but they are more likely to go to the other levels of competitiveness for college. And they are more likely to persist through the different years of college by about 15, they're about 50% more likely at each stage, and it increases the likelihood they graduate by a significant amount. Looking at heterogeneity, effects are strongest for boys, and there's consistent effects across different race and ethnic groups. And interestingly, students who participate in MECO are more likely to be classified as special ed in all of their grade levels. And this is driven by full inclusion, so students who spend most of their time in a general ed classroom. So wrapping up, there's more results in the paper. More work that will be released shortly looks at the impact on the suburban students. And just a highlight of that, overall, we find no impact of the MECO program or having MECO peers on students K through 12 outcomes. There's no negative peer effects that are visible, and we're working on the effects on social and civic outcomes, whether it changes political views. Great, so that's a little bit of what's to come, and thank you all very much for listening, and yeah, I look forward to hearing questions. Oh, and next we have Jillian Betts.
Well, thank you all for coming to this session. This paper is about school choice within a school district, which is a contrast to the last paper, which was about school choice across school districts. The setting is San Diego Unified School District, and the work is joint with Andrew Zhao, Dina Polachar, and Sam Young. I think it's fair to say that most studies of school choice impacts have focused on things like test scores, but there's a growing number of papers that have looked at longer-term academic outcomes, non-academic outcomes. The goal of this paper is to look at the causal effect of winning school choice lotteries on academic, behavioral, and post-secondary outcomes. We've got a range of different outcomes here. Just in a bit more detail, the academic outcomes include test scores in reading and math, whether students get promoted from one grade to the next, and graduation from high school on time. The behavioral, or if you prefer, non-cognitive outcomes include percent of days absent, and some measures of classroom behavior at the elementary level, and grades and citizenship at the secondary school level. And then longer term outcomes look at post-secondary outcomes, including years of schooling and degree attainment. So the statistical approach is quite straightforward. We're cutting through this difficult problem of it being endogenous, who applies to school choice programs, by using lottery results to compare lottery winners to losers. We're comparing 3 types of school choice simultaneously. And we think this could become an issue in the school choice literature more and more as different types of school choice continue to grow in popularity. We have 2 different ways of modeling outcomes for test scores. Similar to a lot of recent work in the charter school literature, we assume a linear effect that changes with the number of years since the time of the lottery. And that's because test scores are theoretically unbounded. But for other outcomes, like did you graduate on time, we assume a one-time effect. So the first equation here is for all the other outcomes except test scores. We have an outcome Y for student I in lottery J, who's currently in grade G, school S, and T is the number of years since the lottery. The first element on the right-hand side is a set of dummy variables for the lottery. Next, we have the key variable, did you win the lottery? So we're testing that beta equals 0. Other regressors, including test scores in math and reading, and demographic variables measured at baseline. Equation 2 is for test scores, and you'll see the only difference is that we replace winning a lottery with winning a lottery times the number of years elapsed. This is a student-based randomization, so we don't need to cluster by school or anything like that, but we do need to cluster by student ID, since test scores appear more than once, and students are sometimes in more than one lottery. The results you'll see in a few minutes for test scores will surprise some people. We pre-committed to looking at the linear impact based on years elapsed, but as a robustness check, we repeated all the test score models looking at year 1 to 3 impacts pooled and separately by year 1, 2, and 3. And the conclusions really are the same as what you'll see in a minute or two. I've talked about 3 different types of school choice programs. Those are magnet schools, a traditional voluntary busing program that has its roots several decades ago in San Diego in a court-ordered desegregation ruling, and then an open enrollment program. Just a bit more detail on each of these. In a typical year, there are roughly 30 magnet schools operating in San Diego Unified School District. Any student inside the district boundaries can apply. And if you live a certain distance away from the school, you will be provided with busing for free. The traditional busing program is voluntary. It used to be based on trying to racially and ethnically integrate the district, but now it's focused on socioeconomic integration. Schools in low-scoring, less affluent areas are paired up with 1 or more receiving schools, and students apply and they receive busing if they win the lottery and accept the offer. Then in open enrollment, this is part of a statewide law. Any student inside the district or from neighboring districts can apply for open seats in any public school, but there's no transportation provided. Just to give you a sense of how the lottery worked, if you applied in a given year to a given school in a given grade, you put into a group based on that. But in addition, there are priority groups. Here's one example. In the early years, the lottery is what this might have looked like. And the point of this is that if a school has, say, 10 slots in grade 3, they will offer slots to everybody in the top few priority groups. Eventually, they'll get to a group where only some get in. So you can see here in group B, only some are admitted. This is the lottery group we're going to be looking at because we need people in the same priority group who both win and lose the lottery for the sake of comparison. Just a little note on the evolution of the lottery. In the most recent 4 years of the data that we have, the number of applications started to be capped. And for the first time, students ranked their applications. And this was essentially an immediate acceptance system where most students got their first choice or second choice. So we actually have fewer true lotteries in the later years than the earlier years. But those later years do contribute. You can see here the years we're studying for admissions in fall 01 through 08, and then again from fall 10 through fall 2013. We have college enrollment data that comes from the National Student Clearinghouse. And the samples are quite large. And so when you see confidence intervals, you realize that the confidence intervals are actually fairly tight. This slide is just giving you a bit more information on the characteristics of the lotteries. You can see that overall, over the years we studied, there were over 23,000 applications to these three choice programs. And you can see, looking at the individual columns, that the busing was the least popular and magnets were the most popular programs. The number of true lotteries is well over 1,000. And again, the greatest number for magnets and open enrollment, the smallest number of true lotteries for traditional busing. Typically, about half of students win, although, as you can see, it varies from program to program. The second to last row is looking at the percent of applicants who both win and enroll in the school they applied to, and typically about 1 out of 5 students both wins and enrolls. The bottom row is perhaps more interesting. This is taking a subsample of students who actually won a lottery and asking what percent of them actually enrolled. And you can see it's typically about 40%. And keep that in mind, because today I'm going to be focusing on intent to treat, the impact of being offered a slot rather than the impact of actually going. So it's always important in a lottery-based study to check that the lottery really truly did randomize. So here are all the background variables that we're including at baseline in our models. I've got the control group means here, and then to the right of that, based on a regression with fixed effects for each lottery, I'm reporting the differences. You can see they're all very small. And then finally, a p-value. We want to see a high p-value here, meaning that there's no significant difference. And you'll see that with one minor exception, the p-values are very high. And the one exception at the very bottom here, you can see that 90% of the control group mean had baseline demographics compared to 89.1% of the treated group, but everything else perfectly balanced. We've done regressions separately for each type of school choice. I'm going to show you the pooled test of impact due to lack of time. And just to remind you, these are intent to treat models. So let's start with the academic outcomes. You'll see here in this row, the impacts, and remember the impact here is of being a lottery winner times the number of years elapsed since you entered the lottery. And you see insignificant effects and fairly small effects as well. Normal grade progression, we see a positive coefficient, but it's not significant. On graduation in time, we do get a significant effect, as you can see. So there's an increase in the probability of graduating on time of 1.85 percentage points. And that's reasonably big compared to the mean share graduating on time, which is 75.3%. So graduation on time, there does seem to be something going on there. For the non-cognitive outcomes, when we pull the data, we're not finding effects on percent of days absent. 2 measures of behavior at the elementary level, whether a student, according to the teacher, perseveres, completes work on time, and whether the student respects others and their property. And then for secondary schools, we have a behavioral GPA based on a citizenship grade that is given to every student. We're not finding effects overall there either, but in all cases, we're finding fairly tight confidence intervals. With post-secondary outcomes, as I said earlier, we look at enrollment. So probability of being enrolled 1 year after graduation, number of years enrolled after 4 years. The right 2 columns are looking at graduation outcomes. And we find positive effects, but in every single case, we cannot reject the null that there is no impact. Some variations when we stop pooling across these 3 types of school choice. That positive overall impact I showed you on the probability of graduating on time, we find coefficients that are positive of similar size for all 3 types of school choice, but when done individually, the standard errors, of course, are bigger. So it's only when we pool that we get a significant result. And then on the non-cognitive outcomes, where I showed you no significant effects, there are 2 exceptions. For magnet schools, there was a significant impact on the percent of days absent, which is quite meaningful. As you can see, a drop of about 1/10. And for busing, there was a slight impact on the degree to which elementary students are judged by their teachers to persevere in their work. So to conclude, the choice program showed a positive impact of the offer on the probability of graduating on time. and the gains are meaningful in size. For magnet and busing programs, we found some positive impacts of about 1/10 of the sample mean for 1 out of 4 of the non-cognitive measures. For magnets, it was percent of days absent. For busing, it was the perseverance grade. We found no impact on test scores, and that's actually robust to different ways of modeling the test score impact. And so far in this preliminary work, we found no impact on college attendance or post-secondary degrees, and be happy to answer questions afterwards. And here's my email address and our web address. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ben.
This is Ben Backus, joint with James Cowan and Dan Goldhaber, and this is going to be a descriptive overview of gifted education in the state of Washington. The background for this is about 7% of students in the US participate in some sort of gifted program, but there's mixed evidence on how effective these programs are. There's a lot of different studies that have found null average effects on student test scores. Some studies have found larger positive effects on minority students or low-income students, but these students at the same time, on average, are identified for gifted programs at lower rates in a lot of locations. And then finally, there's mixed evidence on longer run effects such as high school graduation or college enrollment. And a lot of what we know about gifted programs comes from large programs in large school districts, and it's unclear how well it generalizes. So the purpose of this is part of a larger study on gifted education in the state of Washington, where first we want to kind of describe the landscape of gifted education in Washington, and then in work that will come later, connect that to actual student outcomes. So here we're describing what students are receiving as part of gifted education. As an overview of our findings, we have kind of 3 high-level findings. So the first is that something that should not be surprising at all is that gifted students take more advanced courses and have higher achieving peers. The second is that other things we can measure about classrooms, such as class size or teacher qualifications, teacher background, these tend to be similar across gifted and non-gifted classrooms. And then finally, which is the main message of this project so far, is that there is just tremendous variation in gifted programs across school districts and even within school districts across program design. And I'll talk more about what program design actually means pretty soon. The data for this study comes from the state of Washington during the 4 school years before the pandemic. We have administrative data that categorizes students into the types of gifted programs they're in, which I'll talk about more on the next slide. We can link students to their teachers to know who's teaching these courses. Districts also report information about how their district programs are structured. And we also conducted a survey of gifted coordinators in each district across the state, and we pool all these together for our study here. These are the official definitions for the state of Washington of their gifted programs and the types of instructional strategies that go into each program. For this paper, we follow these categorizations. So we have 4 categories of gifted programs. These are services offered to gifted students through the regular classroom. These are things like independent projects, supplemental instruction. There's acceleration, which is typically access to more advanced coursework. There's these non-traditional programs, which are a very small slice of what we observe in the data. And then finally, there's unique gifted programs. We generally follow this, except we've categorized the unique gifted program based on the extent to which we see students sharing classrooms with other gifted students to try to get at self-contained gifted programs to be consistent with how these are usually conceptualized in prior work. And once we do that, we get pretty close to about 1/3 in self-contained programs, in general classroom programs, and in acceleration programs, with a little bit left over in these other supplemental programs. What we do is we want to compare within each district gifted students to high achieving non-gifted students. The reason we're doing this is that because gifted students are taken from the pool of high achievers, so the right counterfactual for being in a gifted program in a given year is being a high achieving student in that district, not in a gifted program in that year. Once we do this, we're losing a lot of our sample, but that's not surprising given that, again, gifted students are drawn from the top of the distribution. Once we have the sample of high achieving students, we regress some measure of class resources, which I'll talk about on the next slide, on gifted status, things we can observe about a student like prior test scores, and a district fixed effect. So all of the interpretation of all of these is what is the difference in access to educational resources for gifted students relative to high achieving non-gifted students in a given school district. The four resource measures that we look at are a peer index, which is an average of prior year test scores for students that you share the same classrooms with. There's a course index, which is our proxy for the level of advancement of a course, and these are all the average test scores of all students in the given course. And the idea here is that if you're taking a course where all students in that course tend to have high test scores, then that is something we call access to an advanced course. The other two are teacher index, which is predicted value added based on things we can observe about the teacher, which is teacher experience, licensure test scores, educational attainment. And the nice thing about doing it this way is that once we estimate this relationship between value added and teacher observables, we can construct predictive value added even for teachers that aren't teaching in tested graded subjects. And then finally, we can look at average class size. Here is a summary statistics table that is probably too big for PowerPoint, but one of the two messages that I want to convey here is that these first two columns in bold here are comparing the non-gifted sample before and after we're trimming to high achievers. And like we might expect, once we're trimming the sample to students that are observationally similar to gifted students, we end up with a sample that has much higher achievement and is much less racially diverse. We see that once we trim the sample to high achievers, we get students, the non-gifted students have about 1 standard deviation higher average test scores. The other key point on this slide is that if we look across the 4 different types of gifted programs, we see that self-contained is the one that really stands out as being even different from the other types of gifted programs where prior test scores are much higher, and we see they also tend to be exposed to much higher achieving peers in the class as well. Okay, next I'm going to show 2 results slides. So the first one is, again, we're breaking down access to these resource measures on the 4 types of gifted categorizations that we have. So beginning with the top, we looking at the achievement index, which is exposure to other advanced peers in the classes that you take, we see that each of the 4 types of gifted programs or gifted structures on average being gifted relative to non-gifted high achieving students in the same district leads students to be exposed to higher achieving peers. But these effects are largest in the self-contained gifted programs, which isn't surprising given that these are classrooms where gifted students are clustered together. If we look at the course index, which is the level of advancement of courses, we see that the largest effects are, again, in the self-contained classroom, but also in acceleration, which is not surprising because the idea behind acceleration is to provide access to advanced courses. If we look at these other measures, predicted teacher quality and class size, we don't really see any differences for any of the gifted program structures. The last thing that I'm going to show here is we estimate district by district resource effects and then plot how these effects vary by the size of the district. So starting with the upper left, each of these dots, squares, or triangles is a school district. And we see that when we estimate these district by district effects, we see that for districts that are smaller than 1,000 students, there's basically no relationship between being in a gifted program and having access to higher achieving peers. So said another way, the peer exposure is similar for gifted students relative to non-gifted students in these smaller districts. And we see similar pattern for this course index effect, and also if we look at the district poverty rate rather than enrollment. And the message here is that gifted programs aren't really a monolith. There's tremendous variation both across districts and across district types, where large school districts, in results not shown here, tend to offer more self-contained classrooms, self-contained gifted classrooms, and it's these exact types of gifted classrooms that tend to have the largest relationships with the resource measures that we have. So to sum up, about a third of gifted students are in tracked or self-contained gifted programs with access to higher achieving peers and access to more advanced coursework. Another third or so study in accelerated programs that also have some degree of ability grouping and also access to advanced coursework. If we look at other characteristics of classrooms, such as class size and teacher qualifications, we don't really see meaningful differences. And as we just saw on the last slide, resource effects are smaller in or non-existent in smaller school districts and school districts with fewer resources. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And the next presentation will be Kristen Stevens. Thank you.
Hi, I'm pleased to be here today to talk about a research project that we're doing in conjunction with some of my colleagues here at Duke University, Sandy Derrig, Madeline Carrig, Erica Phillips, and Jimmy Reagan, as well as a collaboration with our colleagues at Chicago Loyola, Malik Henfield, Heather Price, and Mako Lynn. And the title of this presentation is Do Gifted Programs Benefit All Students Equally? So, our main research questions, and just to kind of give a general introduction, this entire study is really 4 distinct studies. And so today I'm going to talk about studies 1 through 3 and share results primarily around study 2, and we're currently engaged in study 4. So that's just, I'm going to go through what sort of each study entails, but my focus is going to be on study 2. So some of our research questions that we really were interested in exploring were, to what extent is gifted program participation associated with beneficial academic and student outcomes? So in essence, what works with regards to gifted education? Which students benefit most from participation in gifted programs? So the question, for whom? And what are the malleable factors in gifted education participation and also non-participation in relation to student outcomes? So sort of under what conditions do these outcomes relate to? So phase 1 or study 1 was really looking at local plans in the state of North Carolina, where we've conducted this research. There's 115 school districts, and every school district every 3 years has to submit a plan to the State Board of Education that articulates how they're going to identify and serve gifted students. And these plans are written around a set of program standards, gifted education program standards, that has been approved by the State Board of Education. So we looked at these district plans and sort of identified some things within the plans that we thought, based on what the literature says, are sort of promising equity practices that are going on in terms of gifted education across the state, and also things within the plans that we felt might be potential equity inhibitors. And so some of the promising equity practices are here on the left, and I'll just mention a few of those. You know, there's been a lot written lately about using local norms for determining score eligibility in gifted programs. Districts are also turning towards nonverbal assessments, or allowing other things beyond testing to be considered, like portfolios. And there are also, though, unfortunately, some things that school districts are doing that we know can be potential equity inhibitors, like really having just one single pathway for identification, or really having an over-reliance on test scores and having very rigid cut scores with regards to what they look at for acceptance into the gifted program. So this is where the study kind of starts, kind of get the lay of the land of what's going on across the state in these districts. And it certainly varies in terms of the ways that districts are identifying and serving their gifted students. So the next part that we did is we wanted to kind of look at the demographics of gifted programs across the state. And so we used some publicly available data in order to determine a relative difference in composition index, which is a measure that has been proposed by Ford and King. It's a pretty simple equation. And what this does is it looks at the total number of students in any particular demographic group and compares it to the demographics of that same group within a gifted program. So based on our RDCI calculations, that's that relative difference in composition index, we sort of classified these indices in terms of whether we felt that it indicated that the group was well represented, equitably represented, underrepresented, or substantially underrepresented. And so what these numbers mean, or how you can interpret them, is if you look, for instance, at Black students, it's a negative number. So that means that Black students are underrepresented in gifted programs by as much as 61%. And likewise, Hispanic students are substantially underrepresented by as much as 54%, whereas Asian students and white students are within that well-represented level there. And so white students are overrepresented, if you wanted to use that term, or well-represented by more than 49%. We also kind of looked at kind of what's going on in the district, in the different districts across the state. And so if you look at from the top down, we start the state, that's the Black students representation, then Hispanic students, and then white students are at the bottom. Whereas the pinkish color represents underrepresentation and the blue color is well represented. You can see among white students, there is no pink on their graph. So there is no area in our state where white students are substantially or underrepresented or underrepresented. But you will notice that there are some areas in our state, the far west and the far east, where Black students and Hispanic students, it looks like they're either equitably represented or well represented. If you dig a little deeper and look at those districts, one characterization they have is they have very few students within those groups from the get-go. So it only makes sense that they would be blue because they have very few. They're predominantly white districts. So phase 2 of our study, kind of after we have kind of looked at what districts are doing, what's going on with the demographics in the gifted programs across the state, then we are using a secondary data set that is a data set that has all of the North Carolina public school universe data, student level, school level, teacher level, district level data that we obtained from the North Carolina Education Research Data Center. And our first analysis was to really make a comparison of some of the long-term outcomes differences between students who were identified as gifted and those students who were not identified as gifted but were otherwise high achieving, and to look at differences amongst those two groups by race. We also are doing some propensity score matching with a set of identified variables, and that's currently underway by our collaborative partners at Loyola University. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the academic outcome of AP course enrollment and share some of the findings with regards to that. So for this analysis, it included 72,789 students, and we only included students who attended a traditional North Carolina public high school for all 4 years that we were looking at, which were the years 2014, 15, 16 through 17, and that had non-missing values for all the variables used in the analysis. We didn't use charter schools, so by traditional North Carolina public schools, and we didn't use private schools. So those 72,000 students plus are what ended up being in our sample. Of that, about 11,000 were identified as gifted. So that's about 15% of the population. And we examined all AP courses that were offered in North Carolina, which is 38. So just to give you some demographic data, as I said, about 15% were gifted, and about 21% would be categorized as not identified as gifted, but otherwise high achieving. And then 64% were all of the other students. In terms of ethnicity and free and reduced lunch, here's our demographics for that. So our sample, of course, predominantly white, but a good significant chunk of Black students and Hispanic students. And then for free and reduced lunch, we kind of index this in terms of looking across the students from the time they were in 3rd grade to they graduated from high school, the frequency on which they were eligible for free and reduced lunch. So if they were never eligible for free and reduced lunch, they would be classified as non-free and reduced lunch. If they were persistently on free and reduced lunch, they would have been on free and reduced lunch for every year of every one of those years that they were in school. And then transitorily, free and reduced lunch is if for some of the years, but not all of the years. And so this is just sort of the frequency of those groups within our data set. So here are some of the student level variables that we looked at. And we also looked at, in addition to fixed effects, we also looked at interactions. And so some of our results really align with what the literature says, but there were some that didn't, or were surprising. And so that's what study 4, which is research out in schools, more of a qualitative study where we're interviewing teachers and students, making classroom observations, and doing some survey distribution, is going to hopefully help give some nuance to some of those results that we found surprising. But I'll just kind of hit on a couple of things that I thought were interesting that I've highlighted here on this slide. Hispanic students compared to white students have an approximate 4% reduction in the odds of not taking at least one AP class with all else held constant. So that kind of goes against some of what we think about who's taking AP courses. And among persistently disadvantaged students, the positive effect of AIG status on the probability of taking at least one AP course is weaker for females than males with all else held constant. And the positive effect of AIG status on the probability of taking at least one AP course is larger for Black students than for white students with all else held constant. And the figure here just shows whether some of those statistically significant results were positive or negative impact. And then we also looked, in addition to taking the predicting whether or not they would take at least one AP course, we also looked at the total number of AP classes taken. And one interesting finding was that the positive effect of being AIG on the number of AP courses taken is weaker for Asian students than for white students with all else held constant. And this result, we've given presentations at some other conferences, has been of a big interest to our audience. And so really digging in around why we're seeing this, I think warrants further investigation. And just want to point out the reason why I think the interaction effects are so interesting is that most of the main effects are qualified based on the interaction effects. So that's to say that the main effects end up getting adjusted to varying degrees based on the interaction effects of the particular subgroups of students. And this is just some further contextualization because I'm way over time here. And our next phase, as I said, is we're doing some data collection in schools. And thank you for attending, and I look forward to your questions. And I'm going to turn it over now to Constance Lindsay, who's going to lead our discussion.
Okay, thanks so much for inviting me to discuss the papers here today. I thought these were 4 very interesting papers that all kind of showed the power of what you can do with good research design and rich administrative data that allows you to describe and estimate or analyze particular research questions, and also to understand the who and what behind what might be driving a particular effect. I thought the papers were able to do some really unique things in terms of thinking about subgroups, diving into contextual factors, and then really helping us as the listeners and readers to think about what these results might mean for both implementation and for the implications of the research. So I'll just proceed in the order of the papers, if I get it right. So I'll start with the Boston paper. Elizabeth Saturn and colleagues are looking at the impacts of voluntary desegregation in Boston. And I think this is a really neat study because it has both the historical components that are super important, but then also this modern data that allows the authors to make a contribution as, cities think very hard about race and opportunity and, open enrollment policies and practices that are common across many of our large urban school districts. So a couple of the questions that I had when I was going through the slides, we're just thinking about sort of the who and what of what's driving the results that were found. So one, I was just curious about the types of schools that the students were attending, right? It seems like they're just going to better schools, right? So I wanted to get a little bit more understanding of what were the differences between the places where the students were coming from to the places they were going. Because that seemed to explain a lot of what the particular impacts were. I also wanted to hear a little bit more about what the authors have done to sort of investigate sort of what's driving the results and for whom. I think the characterization of urban versus suburban is a good one, but I'd like to hear more about sort of who constitute and comprises sort of the urban students and who makes up the suburban students. I think that picture is probably a little bit more complicated, particularly as we have, phenomena such as gentrification and other impacts that make cities and suburbs probably look differently than our sort of layperson's characterizations and understandings of those. So just really focusing on adding a little bit more context. And I realized that I just read the slides. I didn't read the full paper. So those are just a few of the questions I had. Moving on to the Betts paper, which is also sort of looking at choice, but within a particular district. I thought this was a really sort of excellent use of the data and a credible research design by sort of building off of the lotteries. I thought one thing the authors did that was nice is that they really captured the sort of nuance and complexity of what happens within urban choice programs, where it's in theory sort of a full choice system, but there's other things layered on, like sibling preferences, different types of priorities, where people sort of try to balance this idea of open choice with also, preferences and priorities that either parents have or policymakers have or stakeholders have. So I thought this was a really, really interesting paper that I think will have lots of wonderful implications for other cities that are grappling with some of this stuff. So here too, I'd like a little bit more thicker description of the context. And in particular, I was wondering about the characteristics of who participated in the lotteries. And I think I saw some of that, but I wanted to know a little bit more about sort of who chooses what, right? It seemed like there are different directions that parents and families could sort from. And I wanted to know if there was sorting, right? Are there, racial and SES patterns in terms of the types of choices that people are making? I don't think this undermines the design at all. I think it's a pretty credible design that allows us to make some causal claims about some of these impacts or some of the things you didn't find. But I was just curious about how we might think about external validity here and think about how this might drive what we would make of this in terms of implications and how to think about designing these lotteries. But overall, thought this was a really awesome study and a great use of the data. So with that, I'll switch to the two papers on gifted programs. So I'll start with the Bax, I think I'm pronouncing that right, and colleagues paper. So this was a descriptive paper, which I thought was really well done. The authors really, so they're using administrative data from Washington State. And I thought what was nice here is that, you know, as Ben sort of said, when we hear gifted, we sort of have assumptions about what we think that means, but there's actually a lot of variation within what gifted means. And you would expect that that variation would have an impact on outcomes for students. And so I thought sort of the first really important contribution here was sort of defining the 4 types of gifted programs across the state and really making those differences across whether programs were self-contained, and pretty much how the services are delivered. And I found myself wondering if, when we're thinking about these analyses for other sorts of programs like special ed or, any kind of, I guess those would be the 2 big sort of the programs related to what we call exceptionalities in North Carolina. I thought that classification was really nice because it was a descriptive, grounded approach sort of that the authors were able to classify these programs. And so here they're seeking to understand sort of this impact of gifted and talented and class resources on test scores. And I thought that was a super interesting way of sort of categorizing it, sort of thinking about, this class resources piece. And something I thought about there was, I really like that concept. I like the way the authors sort of classified that, but I wondered were there other ways to sort of capture resources and to expand upon it? Are there more types of diversity within peers that might be worth capturing? The authors also account for sort of teacher value added and in class size. So it looks like some of the looks like there's some peer effects that are happening here that are mostly driven by the self-contained classes. I was curious about the motivation for the analysis when the authors sort of trimmed for the high achieving students. So I was just curious about what the motivation was for that analysis. And again, I didn't have the opportunity to read the paper. I just read the slides. So it might be delineated a little bit better in the longer version. But I think I'd also like to see maybe a different achievement level, sort of what's happening in these classrooms and what's happening for different types of students within those achievement levels, even though the authors sort of laid out the demographic differences across the different groups. But I was very curious about that. And then again, I'd like to hear a little bit more about the implications from the findings and what this might mean for other policymakers and practitioners who are trying to think about what gifted means sort of in this world where we think very hard about making sure that students of diverse backgrounds have equitable opportunities. So overall, I thought these papers were really interesting, and I thought they really contributed to thinking about our discussions, particularly around various subgroups, sort of broadly defined. I thought the papers did a really wonderful job of sort of diving deep into the data. Oh, and I realized I have one more paper to talk about. Sorry, I didn't mean to leave my dookies out of there. So the last paper uses the North Carolina data that's housed over at Duke to look at over and underrepresentedness in gifted placement. And so I thought this was super exciting. One, because the interactions that you're able to complete in this data set really allow us to explore some interesting areas of intersectionality that usually get ignored, particularly amongst Asian students, interacting things like race and socioeconomic status. And so I really liked the slides where you sort of showed the variation of under and over representation by county and district. I really like the visual representation of the likelihood of completing AP courses, sort of intersecting that with the interactions. The only things I was curious about here were thinking about diving a little bit deeper into what types of schools and sort of where you might see some of these things take place. We know that some schools in North Carolina are more diverse than others. And so I wanted to learn a little bit more about how these overall effects might vary by the diversity of the school. And I'll end there. Thanks.
Okay, hello everyone. Hopefully we have the majority of people who wanted to join the Q&A after our pre-recorded session. Thank you very much for being here. And we have our 4 speakers who are willing to answer questions about their projects and the presentations that you just heard. We also have our discussant here if you had questions about some of her observations during her discussion. So I'm Corrine Alfeld. I'm a program officer in the National Center for Education Research at IES. And I put together this panel from the grantees in my portfolio who were looking at equity of access issues in their projects. And so I'm happy to turn it over to anyone who has a question. You can come off mute, come onto video, or put a question in the chat. So I'll monitor the chat here. Who wants to be a brave first questioner? Thank you, Julie.
So I find this idea of comparing students in gifted programs to high achieving students not in gifted programs kind of interesting. And I'm wondering what you can say about the experience of students who are in high achieving students who are not in gifted programs. Like, why aren't they? Like, what's going on? And you know, essentially, I want to understand sort of the validity of that comparison, I guess, which I'm sure is a question you're going to get a lot of.
Yeah, that's a good question. And yes, we've gotten that before. I think that that's definitely something we need to dig in more. It's just not what we had originally set out to explore, which was how among the pool of high achieving gifted students, how did their experiences compare to high achieving non-gifted students? And then, yes, there's the question of, yes, the question you just raised, and that, yeah, that's definitely something we need to look at more.
I can speak to that too, because that's a part of our project. We don't really know the specifics yet from our study because we're just now going into schools, and interviewing students from those 2 groups is a part of our process. And so that's forthcoming. But I can say just anecdotally and from the literature, I mean, I think there are certainly some high achieving students, probably from underrepresented groups like African American and Hispanic groups, who self-select not to participate in gifted programs just because of the way those programs look, because they are predominantly white in a lot of places, and they may not feel comfortable being in those programs. But then the other side of it is that they could be even though they're high achieving, they could still be missing some of the markers that districts are using to put students in gifted programs. And that could be, you know, there's been a lot written about the variety of reasons why some of the instruments that we're using, some of the processes that are in place, are overlooking or excluding students, whether that be intentional or unintentional. We're still very tied to metrics, and specifically around standardized testing as sort of the hallmarks for the identification process. And unfortunately, I guess, don't rely on some other things that could be equally valuable, just like, for example, something that a teacher may have observed, and, you know, just their own professional opinion that what they're getting in the general classroom setting may not be appropriate, and that they might really excel given more specialized programming.
Other questions? you have a question, just put it in the chat or come off of mute.
Hi, Corinne, it's Michael. I have a question, and it's really for my colleagues in North Carolina. So the Senate budget was just released, and it looks like that AIG funding is already capped in North Carolina. And so we have this issue of having a limited pool of resources from which to serve students. And then the new budget, unfortunately, makes it look like we may see reductions in the amount of funding available, which is not great. And so I'm curious, based on what you've done here, and I'm interested in the idea around, particularly around the AP classes. So I just recently had a presentation from College Board. We were looking at AP participation rates and then kind of disproportionate AP scores in North Carolina. And, we have an entire region of the state that, in essence, we have districts that have 0 AP classes, right? Like students are not participating. I'm just curious what you all think about. I've thrown a bunch of stuff out there. I don't know that it's really a question, but I'm interested in what you all think about in terms of what you've seen here, what the work that you've done. How do we do a better job here at the state agency in both identifying and should we really be pushing more towards something like what they've done? And I think it's in Houston where they've moved to this kind of opt-out honors policy as opposed to an opt-in. Should we be thinking along, right? Does one drive the other, I guess, is the question.
I can respond to that. I think it really varies by school district, and not even just by school district, by school within a school district, in terms of what the prerequisites are or the requirements are for participating in an honors program or in an advanced placement program. And I think that's problematic. I mean, if you're in a school system, you should have access to the same programming, whether you're at school A in this system or school B in this system. And there are some schools that really, I think, serve as gatekeepers to some of those programs, where you have to have a certain grade point average, a teacher recommendation, or what have you, that excludes some students. And so I think that's problematic. With regards to the, and then the other thing that we're starting to kind of see a little bit of in some of our initial data analysis is there's concern that what we put merit on is changing. So as you increase access to things that have been exclusive, then those who are in the majority, or in terms of that have the privilege, are going to search for other ways to get that merit, because now it doesn't have merit anymore if everybody has access. Do you see what I'm saying? And there's people that have written about this, and it's called maintaining inequality. I mean, whether it's conscious or subconscious, it's just that, okay, we're not going to give the same. I mean, look at colleges. They're not, thinking about not looking at certain things anymore, because if everybody has access to them, it's no longer really a distinguishing factor. In terms of the funding, one of the things that I've noticed in North Carolina about gifted funding is that they get sort of through a formula based on the number of students they have, their total student population, not necessarily their gifted population. They get a dollar amount based on that. And in looking at the districts, some districts are able to contribute local funds to enhance what they get from the state. And those that don't. So that's, unfortunate. And if you take the numbers, the average identification percentile in gifted students in North Carolina is somewhere between like 12 and 14%, something like that. But the money that you get from the state is just 4%. So that's a big difference. So what you see is districts that don't have the resources to contribute additional funds to actually support all of the gifted students that they have will have more rigid criteria, because they want to keep the percentage of gifted students low to match what they're getting from the state.
Yeah, we actually made an agency request to the General Assembly to double our funding for AIG to 8%. And clearly they didn't listen to us, since they're changing to this kind of backpack funding model. Yeah, thank you.
Other questions for maybe for other presenters?
Sure. I thought Constance did a great job with her comments on all four papers on her question about who applies to these school choice programs. And also implicit, I think, in that is what sort of schools are they applying to? The average student in San Diego is applying to a school that has higher test scores, higher value added, higher percent white students. The busing program and the magnet program both provide busing, and those programs seem to actually be integrating the district. So that's telling you that, for instance, underrepresented racial groups are really applying to those programs. It's less so with the open enrollment program, and that's the program that doesn't provide busing, and it doesn't really seem to be integrating the district, say in racial or ethnic terms.
Julian, one thing I'm wondering about with your study is it really an assessment of sort of the impact of peer effects versus the impact of any particular instructional model kind of thing? Because I think you're not necessarily delving into what's different about these schools, or maybe you are, you just didn't get a chance to talk about it in the short amount of time. But the way that you're talking about it is it's more about sort of who else is in the school and not necessarily about what's happening in that school.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to unpack that. We are going to be doing some mediator analyses, but you're exactly right. It's not like a randomized controlled trial where you're changing one element. You're changing everything. The peers are changing, and that if you look at contrast between the next school students would have automatically attended next year versus the school they applied to, what really jumps out at you is the peers are really quite different in terms of socioeconomic background and so on. There's some differences across teachers though as well, but it's not a pure controlled experiment, and that all these things are different. And so I think where we're on the firmest ground is there an impact rather than explaining any impacts we find. That's a really good point.
Thank you all for the presentations, and thank you, Constance, for the comments. It's been a great session. My question is for Julian, just given your work with the lottery in San Diego, if you can think of sort of changes to the preference and priority structure or other structural aspects of the algorithm that could be equity enhancing.
No, that's a great question. So the district actually did change things in the last 4 years of the program. In the first few years, you could apply to as many schools and programs as you wanted. And so probably what that means is that people were not always getting their first choice, and that might have implications for diversity, for example. In the final few years of the program, they moved to what I first thought was a deferred acceptance program, but when I looked at it more and talked with others, I realized it's actually more like an immediate acceptance program. You can only apply to, I think it's 3 or 4 schools. You have to rank the programs, and they admit as many as they can to their first choice preference. And if you don't get into that one, then you get into your second choice preference. So that might lead to better matches. The people are more likely to get their first choice. Most students applied to 2 schools in the old days. So you're more likely to get your first choice, I think, that way around. The preferences that exist, such as sibling reunification, I think that's just to make life much more manageable and bearable for parents who are worried about where you pick up kids and when are bell times, when does school start and end, and that can vary, of course, across schools, and that can get really complicated if you've got kids in different schools. There was also during this period sort of thanks to the federal government, I think something that really benefited lower performing students, and that was in that sample I showed you in one of the slides. I showed you things like sibling reunification and so on, but after No Child Left Behind got really rolling, one of the top priority groups actually was, are you in a program improvement school? So that would really give much higher priority to students who were applying from schools that weren't meeting their targets, and largely those would be students from more diverse backgrounds. Deferred acceptance might be the best of all. The district's almost there, but not quite now.
Thank you.
Anyone else have a question for any of our presenters? Can put it in the chat or come off mute. How about, do you have questions for each other, the presenters?
I have a question, I think, for Ben. I believe it was your study where you talked about creating a variable for teacher quality. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so teacher quality may or may not be the right term for this, but what we do is we run a regression predicting student test scores based on what we can observe about teachers. And in this case, this is things like teacher experience, the license they hold, and the licensure test scores they have. So we have these predictors of student achievement given what we can observe about the teacher. And then we chose this approach because once we have these estimated relationships, we can form predictions for teachers whether or not they're actually observed in tested grades or subjects. So we can only run the first stage regression where for teachers that actually have students that are taking tests, but once we have these relationships, we can estimate what we call teacher quality or teacher, something correlated with teacher quality for every teacher. And then we can look at whether students in gifted classes are systematically exposed to higher quality or more experienced teachers.
We're actually out of time for our question and answer period, but I appreciate everyone's listening to this session and coming to the Q&A. Thank you to our presenters. And I have been asked to remind you to rate the session in the agenda after the end. I think that's in the main agenda for the conference. Thank you, everyone.